Good morning. This is Chewing the Gristle, a poetry chat with Al Black and Tim Conroy. Our guest today is our friend, the poet Ray McManus. Ray McManus is from here in rural South Carolina, from a working class Irish American family. His poems have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. His first book was Driving Through the Country Before You Were Born. His next book is Red Dirt Jesus, great book by the way. And his third book is Punch. And Punch he's won some awards and it's still getting some play. And I recommend you check out all three books. Ray is a full professor at the University of South Carolina, where he got his MFA and his PhD. His PhD is in rhetoric and composition. He has different positions. He's a director of faculty and curricula and courses. And he's also, I don't know the exact title, but he's like the artist or poet in residence at the Columbia Art Museum, and he's doing some really good things there. So we want to start by introducing Ray with this question. And this question is, Ray, as you, as a poet, were you interested in poetry from a young age, or is this a interest that developed later? And who were and are your poetry influences?
That's a good question. First of all, thank you, Al and Tim, for inviting me on this Chewing the Gristle, which I think is a great title. But I think this is an awesome opportunity for poets and for in sharing, you know, the power of poetry and sharing really, I think, you know, some really amazing poets with the rest of the country, rest of the world. So, you know, you guys are just lovable creatures, man. To answer your question, Al, which is a pretty interesting thing for me, you know, I did not grow up with poetry in my house. You know, my family, my parents worked full time. I was a latchkey kid, me and my sister, you know, in rural Lexington County on a dirt road with not really a whole lot to do. And so because there weren't books in the house, I set fire to things and, you know, killed all the ant beds in the yard and, you know, did probably some other destructive things that I won't get into, but in case my mama listens to this later. You know, I didn't really have poetry or literature as a way of escaping. You know, I had the woods. You know, that's where I spent a lot of my time, was in the woods. And but I had music, and I was always drawn to, as much as I was drawn to the music, to the rhythms, to the, you know, good, hard, crunchy guitar, you know, Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath or something like that. I was always drawn to the lyrics. There was something about the lyrics, the stories that they could tell in a song, the way language could be used, could be manipulated, could be turned onto itself to make sense out of things that don't make sense. And so you know, I was drawn to that, I think, early on, and actually wanted to be, you know, I wanted to be a musician. You know, that was kind of, you know, the thing that I thought would be so cool to do. And so in 10th grade, I had gotten in trouble in high school and was sent to in-school suspension. And it just so happened we had to read books and write these little one-page synopses of the books that we read. And one of the books, just, I don't know why the librarian put it on my table, but it was Sound and Sense. And it was this really cool anthology and poets that I should have probably known who they were at the time if I had paid any attention, perhaps in an English class. But I started thumbing through it, and you know, it Dickinson and Whitman and Frost and Eliot and I think Plath was in there, and and I'm reading this stuff, and I'm falling in love with the language again, but in such a different way. Like I looked at these as lyrics, not as poems, and thought, man, this would be really cool to try to imitate some of this for the songwriting ability that I was going to have, for the band that we were going to be into. Once we all learn how to play musical instruments. Never learned how to play the musical instrument, but that's for a later story, I suppose. But I fell in love with that book so much I stole it, and I kept that book for about 25 years. I've since taken it back to my old high school and gave it back to the new library, and I think the one I had at the time is probably passed, but and wrote a little inscription that I had stole the book 25 years ago, and it saved my life. And at the time I thought I was just kind of a clever way of sort of writing this nice little inscription, but it turned out it actually did save my life. When probably it would have been years later, but probably by the time I was a senior in high school and getting ready to go to college, which was a little scary for a guy like me, first generation, really, not really knowing what college was about. I just knew I didn't want to be a small engine repair mechanic, for the rest of my life, or work swing shifts at Michelin. And so when I went to college, I was, I had that book with me and started, just trying to write a few things, just trying to get a few things out. And I found my way over to USC Aiken, and was under the tutelage of Stephen Gardner, who has since passed. But Stephen took the time to look at some of my poems, and I'll never forget. I mean, he wrote very generous comments to what were really shitty poems. I mean, they were horrible things, full of angst and kind of playing around with things, but he would find stuff in the poem that was really good, that he liked, and was like, do more of this, encouraging me, to do more of this. And at the time, he turned me on to some other poets. I did not know who the Beat Generation was. I didn't know who Allen Ginsberg or Jack Kerouac or Burroughs or Corso or any of these guys were. And he kind of turned me on to him. He's like, hey, you might dig this. And so he gave me a copy of Howl. And when I read Howl, it blew me away. I had never seen poetry written like that before. Now granted, my experience was pretty limited. But the honesty, the rawness of it, really, it just appealed to me. Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti were two that I just got swept away by. Now, when I got to the Columbia campus, still sort of kind of feeling my way around, not real sure what I wanted to do. I had an advisor, well, she wasn't my advisor at the time, she was a professor, and I was taking her rhetoric for writers class, which I didn't even at the time know what the hell rhetoric was. I just saw writers in the title and I thought, I'd like to be one of those, I think, maybe, and so I took her class, which was really a blast, with Carolyn Madeline, and she said two things to me that semester that ultimately put me on track for where I am now. And she said, one, stop coming to her class stoned, which was really important, because at the time I just figured nobody knew that. And she's like, don't come to my class stoned anymore. You're wasting your time. You're wasting my time. This is costing you money. Don't be stupid. And so by the end of that semester, and I took her advice, and it turned out, I was like, wow, it's amazing how much you can pay attention when you're not, thinking about, man, I'm hungry, or, kind of dozing off, or, going off into a daydream out the window at a squirrel leaping from, one of the trees or something. And so by the end of the semester, I asked her if she'd be my advisor. And she said, yeah, you definitely need one. So she became my advisor, and their first advising meeting, she said, you should take Ed Madden's poetry workshop. And I never had taken a poetry workshop in college, you know, and but he, you know, Ed, and I didn't know who Ed Madden was. He just seemed less scary to me than James Dickey, and still seems that way. When I took Ed's workshop, that's when things took off, because Ed turned me on to so many contemporary poets that I would have never known at the time, you know. Turned me on to Sharon Olds. You know, Sharon Olds became such an important, I think, literary influence for me, because to me, where Ginsberg could be honest and raw and visceral, you know, Sharon can too. There's no two ways about that. But she was able to do so with a certain level of elegance and command that, you know, to me was just like, you know, yes, that's how you can do it. That's how you can talk about, you know, the Pope's penis and it still be in this incredible poem, and it's not just there for shock value. You know, it's something that actually makes you think about something that you probably shouldn't or wouldn't think about. And he turned me on to Caroline Forche, and he turned me on to Louise Gluck, you know, powerful women poets that became such vital influences for me. And he also turned me on to Lee Young Lee, and who I loved, you know, his sense of lineage and, you know, and the way he was able to work through those things. And so that pretty much put me on a trajectory. Now, what was interesting about that workshop is he had brought a guest poet in. This guy, who at the time was over at USC Sumter, where I am now, didn't know much about him, just knew his name sounded kind of funny. And, but he was, you know, born in Ghana and grew up in Jamaica and lived and had a reggae band in Canada. And now he's at Sumter of all places. And Ed read us some poems from this book called Shook Foil, and brought in this guy named Kwame Dawes. Now, as soon as Kwame got there as guest poet for that day, I think he was made, I think we, you know, Columbia snagged him up within a year and brought him onto the Columbia campus. And so Kwame then became, you know, the other pillar, I think, in helping, you know, to bring on and expose to me, you know, a whole new world of poetry that I didn't know existed, you know, and some of it from a post-colonial standpoint, some of it just African poets, some of it just being Caribbean poets, but bringing in more of an international understanding and within a national understanding, especially within African-American poetry. And, you know, and through Kwame, then, you know, man, the dam just broke. I mean, you know, I find Terrence Hayes, I find Nikki Finney, you know, who looked me dead in the eye one day when she asked me, she said, do you write poetry or are you a poet? And I was like, no, ma'am, I just write poetry, thinking I was being funny. And she looked me dead in the eye, man, like she was going to kill me across the table. And after the meeting, you know, after lunch or whatever, and we were saying goodbye, she just grabs my hand, pulls me in, looks me dead in the eye and said, don't play with it. And I mean, I was just sitting there stunned for a second. You know, part of my, you know, 12-year-old brain was like, don't play with what, you know, but I didn't want to go there with her. She scared the crap out of me, you know, and but afterwards, I know what she meant, you know, like, you know, you're going to do this. You go all in and do this, or just get out of the way, you know, and I wanted to go all in and do this. So, you know, my influences come in various ways, I think, you know, I mean, my two dads are totally Ed Madden and Kwame Dawes. There's no two ways about that. They essentially raised me, you know, coming in wild and raw and still that way, I think, you know, but have, you know, put me on a path that I could have never imagined the destination. I could have never imagined how far that would go. Between, you know, the work it takes to be a poet. It's not just about sitting around writing poems when you feel like it, you know, but reading other poetry, you know, reading is so crucial to our ability as writers. It'd be like a musician trying to play an instrument but never listening to music. I mean, that's just unheard of, right? I mean, so, you know, they taught me the responsibility of that, or the value of that, I should say, and then the responsibility of community, because that to me is what sort of instilled the value of, as a poet, how important the community is to what we do and how much we can do for a community. And so with Ed's activism and Kwame's activism and creating opportunities when there weren't opportunities, you know, poets on the job, I think was something Kwame had going on where, you know, you could be the poet laureate of Wachovia, you know, or something like that, which is crazy wild, you know. And a lot of what, you know, we have, you know, kind of, you know, at the time, you know, there wasn't an Al Black who was doing, you know, 15 different, you know, workshops or readings a week, you know, and, you know, there wasn't a Conroy Literary Center, you know, there wasn't, you know, the things going on in Columbia just weren't happening. And so we created a lot of those opportunities, and I got to be in there sort of on the ground floor and watch this sort of thing happen. And I'll tell you, man, there's nothing more exciting than watching somebody like Kwame's wheels turn and the ideas that come out of his head, you know, which I would be sitting there, you know, this white kid from South Carolina thinking, man, ain't no way in hell something like that's going to go down. And, you know, and then he just creates like this poet summit out of thin air and brought, you know, I mean, that's probably simplifying, and there was a lot of planning that went into that, but it brought poets from all over the state here to Columbia. And because of that experience, I ended up gaining friendships that I still have today, and networks that have blossomed into some really incredible things, that I can't help but think, you know, if I hadn't have been there, that little punk ass kid in high school that got in trouble, or if I hadn't have gone, you know, just up and decided I was going to go to college and happened to be in the right place at the right time, you know, there's no telling what would have happened or how I would have been influenced by any of these things. So, you know, as much as I'm influenced by, I think, by writers, I've been influenced by people that, you know, just took the time, and which is something I carry with me today. So, you know, when I'm working with, or somebody comes up to me and says, you know, I've got some poems, you know, but I'm not sure what to do with them, or, you know, I've been writing poetry for years and I just don't know where to go with it. You know, I mean, it's easy for us to get, I think, bogged into our daily lives, and I got a billion things going on. I mean, if you look at my bio, it almost makes you motion sickness, you know, just reading all the stuff I do. But taking that time and being patient and listening to other people and offering advice when you can offer it, and just taking the time to read their work and give them some good, honest, you know, feedback, you know, not criticizing them, just giving them good, honest feedback. Goes a long way, you know, just to cultivate and to continue to cultivate what was so generously given to me, you know, and to this day, you know, I still hold all those folks with the highest regard, because there'd be no Ray McManus without them, that's for sure.
Hey, Ray, how about reading a few of your poems for us, man?
Sure, man. I'm going to read a couple of new poems. Well, you know what? You held up Punch, so I'll read a poem from Punch, and then I'll read a new poem. So this is a poem called "On the Tour at DJJ." So if you know, for those of you who don't know what DJJ is, it's the Department of Juvenile Justice, and I'm not going to get into why, but I got to tour the facility. I think it's somewhat apropos, I think, for what's going on right now. On the tour at DJJ. They gather halos from the field and drown them in buckets under the tap. The deputy gets loud and busted vandals start to sing. When he laughs, imagine lines and about faces, buckles and not bending. Think about hair pulling and the motor coughing to start. The way you must look when you realize the road doesn't dead end after all. For every time the deputy rakes the stick across the bars, think a love poem tattooed on the gums, the iron on the anvil. For every shove against the wall, think a fall afternoon on your parents' back porch, the air cool against a hot sun, birthdays, sex, the sleep you had before the dog went missing. Then, when the deputy looks you in the eye, he'll stop laughing. Then a new poem, which, well, I think the poem will tell us all we need to know. I don't think I need to give you a whole lot of banter in this, other than the fact that this poem is John Lane's fault. So if John Lane is listening to it, yeah, this is for you, John. It's called Reproduction. A boy stares out the window and asks what's wrong, just like his dad did, while the German shepherd humps the neighbor's poodle. He sees how size only matters by the qualifier, the difference between a larger dog trying to straighten his hind legs while stuck to a smaller dog, and his dad walking towards them with a water hose. In church, he will learn words like master and bind, the danger of oxen and unequal yoke. In his bedroom, he will learn how his dad shot the dog. A boy stares out the window and asks why, just like his dad did, and he'll be told the philosophy of male dogs, how it's not their fault. If they can't eat it or fuck it, they piss on it. And he'll think his dad laughs, so he will too. How one life evolves from the next into a singular moment, plays through the replica of a son confronting the pain of this world and a dad's instinct to reproduce a joke when there's not one. And a boy hears that he's not a dog, despite his compulsion to force pieces where they don't fit. And a boy hears that sometimes we get jammed, sometimes we die trying, just like his dad did. And a boy hears this as a primer to a harder speech about what he'll inherit, just like his dad did. And everything he hears will ruin his life.
That's awesome, man.
Thanks, brother.
Well, I want to know what advice you would give to the emerging poet about rejection. Yeah, they have written their heart on the paper and they send it out and they get rejected.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell them?
Well, I wish I could say that that gets better, but it doesn't. I mean, after, I've been writing for, seriously for 20 years, and I still hate rejections. They still bother me, I mean, I suppose I'm used to it. I think the big thing too is sort of to demystify it a bit, right? I mean, I've been published in a lot of journals, and and 3 books, an anthology, and hopefully a new one on the way. And I guarantee you, I have 10 times more rejections than I do acceptances. It's part of it. I think the thing that letting young writers know is that rejection isn't personal. It's not that the journal editor just doesn't like your work. It's just that it doesn't fit that particular journal for what that editor is wanting to do for that particular issue. Doesn't mean that you couldn't send out a poem and within 6 months later, and then same editor picks it up because it just happened to fit what that editor is wanting to do for that particular issue. When I first started, I thought that it literally was somebody sitting at a desk, gets this big stack of poems and says, oh, I like this one, I don't like that one. And of course, there's some subjectivity to it. There's no doubt about that. I mean, they're the editor. They get to make that choice. But what I found in learning and talking more to editors, you start to become friends with other poets who happen to be editing a journal or guest editing a journal. And you start learning a little bit more about what goes into trying to put that thing together. Obviously, they're going to take, work that they consider to be really good or the best or that they like for whatever reason, but they're also trying to build something in that journal. You know, and sometimes, you know, it's a theme, sometimes it's a myriad of themes, and that sort of thing. So my first advice is, you know, not to take it personally when it happens. You know, you just got to keep going. Now it's a lot easier now than it was when I first started, because when I first started sending work out, the idea of a simultaneous submission was just unheard of. You submit your 5 best poems at Paris Review, and then you wait 2 years later for them to reject you, you know. Now you can send, you know, those 5 poems to 10 different places through Submittable, keep track of everything. And then if it gets accepted, you just simply go to your other journals and let them know that, hey, this poem out of that batch got accepted. So I got to withdraw it, you know, and most of those journals will be like, okay, great. You know, they'll look at the other 4, you know, and so rather than just saying, well, fine, we'll just take them all out. So that is to me a little easier, I think, dealing with the idea of, you know, okay, well, this journal rejected me, but I've got it sitting out in 10 different journals. So let's see what the other 9 think. Now, of course, if all 10 rejected, it's still, you go back to your default. It's not personal, you know. It just so happened I sent this one, you know, this batch of poem to 10 journals that maybe I didn't know a lot about. So then my other sort of, so staying organized and being with a program like Submittable or Duotrope, even if you want to pay a little bit, you can do that. That's another piece of advice. And then, of course, the other is, early on, you know, not only did you have to wait a long time, but if you wanted to see what a journal published, you know, you would have to order a back copy. You would have to wait for that back copy to come to you in the mail. Then you would read that, and then you would have to sort of decide, okay, well, it seems like I kind of write work that they seem to publish. Well, that was kind of hit or miss. But at that particular journal, for that particular issue, maybe they did publish some poems that sound kind of like your work that you do. But that doesn't mean that the other 5 issues are, you know, that came out, you know, right before it or right after it do. And so now, because so many journals put, you know, some of their work online, you can see it, certainly their back issues online. It gives, I think, folks an opportunity to sort of explore the journal, see what kind of work they normally or typically publish. And so you're not, you know, sending work out to a journal that might be fine work, but it's not typically the kind of work that the journal does. And so, and I think that's really important now because, you know, if you notice, it used to be, you know, almost rather singular in the types of poets that journals seem to be publishing. You know, if they'd gotten books out and their names were recognized, no problem. If you were young and emerging, it seemed to be really hard to kind of break into, you know. Now there's so many journals that are specifically looking for emerging poets of color, emerging poets that are coming from all sorts of backgrounds, international backgrounds. You know, there's a place now for, it's so inclusive. For just about every voice you can possibly think of. And so in as much as we should celebrate that, we also need to understand that that means that because there's that variety out there, you know, you just need to be a little careful about where you want to send your work to, you know, and thinking about, you know, I don't want to send all my work to, you know, to the New Yorker. I mean, I don't, you know, good luck. I mean, I would be the first one to celebrate for anybody to get published in a New Yorker. They're going to publish 2 poems an issue, you know, when there's so many other journals out there. And then finally, I'd say the last thing is don't look down on the online journals that are out there. There are some incredible digital online journals. They put in the work to put a really good looking journal together online. And if you think about it, you know, if I get published in Prairie Schooner, you know, I'm going to get my contributors copies. I'll get my 2 copies. Everybody who contributed is going to get their 2 copies. You might take a picture of it and put it on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. if I've got it online, if it's an online publication, man, everybody around the country can see that, you know, and so there's a lot of value there, and it's a great way too to help sort of build your you know, sort of your acumen, right, of you know, getting some work out there and getting some recognition. And so so I would say, you know, that'd be my fourth thing, is don't overlook the importance of online journals out there as well.
Within the idea of getting published in journals, whether online or otherwise, what is the importance, especially what's happening today, this week, the last couple months? What is the value, or how does one take their craft and their experience as a writer and looking at the experiences of today, and what is your responsibility as a poet to write to what's happening today?
Well, I think that's sort of twofold, you know, honestly. I think one is that, you know, if you're a writer, if you're a poet especially, you should be writing every day, you know, whether you're putting a physical pen down to a piece of paper and writing, or you are at a computer writing, or you're doing it all in your head, you know. There isn't a moment, I don't think, that goes by. I think this might have been what Nikki was alluding to me when she said don't play with it, you know, is that, you know, there's not a moment that goes by, not a single thing I see, not a thing that I am, you know, blessed to encounter that I don't see a poem in. And that's a blessing, but it's also a curse, you know, because there are some things that I want to just enjoy for the moment, or I want to just be within myself for the moment. And yet I am compelled, I am driven to needing to write about it. Now, the risk that one takes writing about everything, you know, especially when, you know, you've got what's been going on, you know, you find out too that, you know, what we're seeing today is not something that is just going on today. Unfortunately, it has been going on for years. I mean, you could even go back and say hundreds of years. And what we're seeing now is a culmination of that. You know, you know, all it takes is that one needle on the balloon, you know, and so what I'm finding is that, you know, if you are just writing about what you see in front of you, I mean, my God, how do you ever finish anything? I mean, because it's a continuation that's happening. Now, when you're writing about a singular moment or a specific moment, and that is published, the responsibility that I think that the writer has to remember is that when that's published, it becomes social artifact. And it's so important for people to understand that, you know, years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people, you know, God, I hope there's still a planet, but, you know, if there is, people are going to look back, and yeah, they're going to look at history books, right? But history books are, you know, they're full of facts and figures by whoever, you know, it happens to be in power. Whereas poetry becomes an artifact of everyone, a singular person in a singular moment, and you take those collectively together, and you end up becoming, you end up getting a fuller picture of what's happening, how people are feeling, what people are having to deal with, what questions do they have, you know, going through some, you know, rather tumultuous times. I mean, like I was talking to some students a year or two ago in a creative writing class, and I was like, you know, what do you know about the 60s? Like, you know, what, I mean, you know, I was born in 72. I know nothing about the 60s. So what do I turn to when I want to know more about the 60s? I said, what would you turn to? And almost every single one of them told me, I would go to the music. I would listen to the music, because the music would tell me what people are thinking, what people are feeling in the 60s. And so when I'm, you know, when I'm getting that sense of, you know, you know, why should we all love each other? You know, why should we get together and love each other? You know, why should we, you know, or you know, I kind of understand now, you know, why LSD was so prevalent. You know, I mean, you know, there was this, you know, this notion of you know, that the history books, even though they know they can go there and get a decade's worth of history, written by whom, you know, whereas they could listen to the music, and that could have been the guy that lived down the street that got a band going in their garage, and you know, and wrote this song, you know, that doesn't have a whole lot of meaning behind it, but yet was so important, so vital. Why? It brings up those questions. This was something that my friend Dawson Jones, Mac Jones, and I had kind of talked about with the images that were at the South Carolina Library, or still at the South Carolina Library, where they digitalized all of the images that they had in their archives. And that when you look at a photograph, for instance, and, you know, getting poets to write about this, that, you know, they're not changing the history. They're actually looking at a snapshot of history of normal, everyday people, of a normal, everyday event, and are giving voice to it, and how that becomes kind of this wild sort of way of understanding the history of that time by looking at what was captured in a singular moment, rather than trying to think of this giant, expansive sort of thing where international and domestic relations coexist, and then all this tension's created, and then this president and that senator, and all these different things that I think becomes really difficult for people to relate to, you know, or would want to. I know today we seem to think that everything is political, but truly the poetry is what is connecting us. And so I think, you know, I'm encountering the same images that everybody else is. You know, I'm seeing the videos that are out on Facebook. I'm seeing them on Twitter. You know, I'm turning not just to one news source, but multiple news sources, because I like to see how each one takes an angle on a story to get a fuller picture. But to be honest with you, I'm going to turn to the poet who is going to write from their experience, because that, to me, is the only thing that really is real, even though they could be lying. You know, it's the only thing that feels, you know, like it's something that I'm able to internalize, the same way we do with music, the same way we do with other art. And so I think, you know, that is something that we have to, when we're writing about these things, we have to think about how other people are going to not react to it, but how they're going to ingest it, how they're going to keep it with them, how they're going to grow from it. And sometimes that is, you know, that's not something that's always in the forefront when we sit down to write about something, because we're inspired or because we're angry. And so, you know, thinking about audience is so important.
Hey, Ray, can you tell us what you're working on now, and let the listeners know how to get a hold of your books?
Mm-hmm.
Be after answering both those questions, read a few more points.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the book that I've finished and then I'm shopping around now is called A Beautiful Wreck. Has gone through multiple revisions and title changes and everything else, you know, that one would expect. But it's a book that very much is, you know, looking at sort of the traditional sort of stereotypes and tropes of Southern masculinity. You know, growing up, Generation X, like I said earlier, latchkey kid, I spent a lot of time, you know, letting TV kind of raised me when I was growing up, you know, and it was always an interesting sort of juxtaposition, because where I grew up, men were men, you know, they pitched their hay and killed their own cows and, you know, dug their ditches and paved their roads and all this stuff. And yet when I'm watching television, I'm seeing, you know, Klinger on MASH, or I'm seeing, you know, Bosom Buddies, or I'm seeing, you know, different, you know, Tootsie, I think, had just come out, you know, and so I'm seeing all these sort of different representations of men that didn't fit within this sort of stereotype that was sort of being pushed onto me, you know. And so it's something that I really had thought a lot about, you know, as a husband, as a father, you know, and then 2016 happened. And when that happened, I started to see, you know, this regression, if you will, because honestly, I mean, under the Obama presidency, you began to start to really hear men bringing up the questions of, you know, what makes a man? What is it that, you know, because what we've always heard isn't true, you know? And so there was, I don't know, it felt like there was some hope, you know. You had men starting to talk more about health problems that they were having. You start seeing more PSAs about getting colonoscopies and prostate cancer and all these really important things that men need to talk about that never talked about, you know. I mean, we didn't even like talking about how we have to turn our heads and cough, you know. But yet women have been, you know, since the time that they were, you know, old enough, were going to doctors and basically having to be spread out in front of everyone and have all these sorts of devices inserted in them and have to talk about their health very openly. And yet men, for whatever, big strong man, you know, big penis and balls walking around everywhere, you know, we can't talk about that kind of stuff. It just seems stupid to me. And so when I think it was shortly after the, I had started writing poems about that. And then shortly after the Access Hollywood tape had come out, and, you know, where you got Trump talking about, you know, you just go up and grab him by the pussy. And I remember having a conversation with my mom about it, just how, you know, just disgusted I was by it. And she was like, you know, well, that's how men talk. And I was like, that's not how this man talks. That's not how you raised me to talk. What the hell are you talking about? That's how men talk. And so that really became the part that sort of pulled this book together. And so A Beautiful Wreck, which does kind of steal from a little bit from Dickey's Cherry Log Road, you know, where, you know, this idea in the end of that. And I would encourage people to read that book, read that poem, because it's a fantastic sort of poem. But this idea of being, you know, this wild and sort of forever wreck that we are. So the book's about that. And then I've started finally working on some other new stuff that I think kind of comes out of this response, you know, of you know, kind of being at home a lot more these days, and trying to figure out all of that. So, which I'll tell you, man, when you got, you know, my wife and I both are, you know, working for the university, and with kids, raising kids, you know, and trying to homeschool them and do our jobs. And, you know, it's been insane. But I'll read, I'll read 2 poems from A Beautiful Wreck, and then I'll read a brand new one, kind of around this COVID-19 thing. So.
Wonderful.
All right. So, so this is the first poem, from, the opening poem, if you will, from A Beautiful Wreck. What it will take to stay sober. My dad pokes at the woods and tells me I can be anything I want, so I follow him. He tells me we need the stick for snakes. He knocks around small brush instead. For years, we stop where the pines claim a dry basin, and it is my job to imagine him when he was younger, how he would take whatever water was still there. His story is always sad, marked by trash pile and straw mound, cars he never drove, and eventually he stabs his stick into the ground. This is why I never drank, he says, and he leaves me there. This next poem, well, this one just cuts right back to the matter of what I was talking about earlier about men's health. I don't want to get into the whole backstory on this, just to, in case anyone at home might be eating. It's called Dickhole. Take it. The sand in the eye, broken glass in the boot, the vinyl in your teeth, from the back of the headrest in your mom's Ford Fairmont, the stirrup, the speculum, the fingers that have been inside your wife, her legs spread open for strangers, the gaze and the scrape of it, like a man. You can hardly say it without curling your upper lip, your body unable to relax, unable to cope with the idea that something going in could be worse than what comes out. You can hardly feel the weight of the word on your tongue, just the heavy S's striking the T's and P's, the spurt, the venom, all at once. Then the snake spent and lifeless, the hands of a plumber, the fit. And you lie there, the hole cut out, the metal clamp, the curtain. Don't be nervous, she says. Best to relax, she says. This is the numbing solution. I told that nurse that I was going to be writing a poem about that. And I said, you got any advice you want me to give men? And she said, yeah, don't be a pussy. I was like, okay. Oh, I should have got her name because I could have dedicated that one to her. All right, so here's a brand new one. I was asked, I was asked by Cindy Boyder to contribute a poem that I think Muddy Ford is wanting to work on an anthology for the COVID-19 situation. And I know you guys are probably a lot like me. I have a very hard time telling Cindy no to anything, so it's a dangerous thing, but it's true. But it was so good because it got me really kind of not thinking about this book anymore and kind of moving into a new direction. And I owe her so much anyway. So it's a poem called Nobody's Bargain. I watch her and she watches me, moving from office to den to backyard, and then den to office to backyard again, the side grin between sliding glass doors, then office to kitchen to den to bathroom to office to bed, and then the morning comes fast. Another day moves faster than the one before until it feels like it's not moving at all. And then there's the morning we yell because another day moves louder than the one before until it forces us to scream our words if we have anything to say. And I hear her, and she hears me, moving from pantry to fridge to stove to porch to stove again, running into furniture and cursing the ash on the carpet. And I hear her ask what's wrong, and she hears me say nothing because my throat hurts and I don't know if I can smell what's cooking or burning, and nothing can distract me from the fact I could be responsible for killing everyone in this house, or my neighbor's house, or my parents, or her parents, or the cashier at Lowe's Foods where I bought a beer and walked around the store sometime in early March thinking about how much I liked seeing some of the people in Jasper County, Georgia. How easy it was then to not know anything and just feel, to think distance required agency, to see food on the shelves. And it's at that moment when I start to question what I cannot taste before I even put it in my mouth, and I feel her hand on my back. And it's at that moment she feels me let go and breathe as I look through the door of the stove. Smells good, she says, and I'll be damned. She's right.
That's great.
Thanks, man.
Mm-hmm.
So
We want to thank you.
Yeah, we want to thank you. Tell us how to get your book, Punch, or the folks out there.
Absolutely. The easiest way would be just to go to my website, www.raymcmanuspoetry.com. If you click on books, and they should be linked to the publishers, which I think is very important. Hub City Press, man, they have just grown into such an amazing press, and they just gave that book so much love and attention. I mean, it's the coolest cover. I mean, I think the world of Meg, and of course, you know, Betsy and everybody there that has really put that thing together. And so it's important, I think, to support our independent presses. So you can go there, you can check out where to get books, you can contact me, and I also try to put up there various, you know, media and things like that, you know, that I've been doing some other stuff, you know, whether it's with the museum or, you know, various things that I get published along the way. So I'll even have a link to this when all this gets done, man, on there. So.
Well, that's wonderful. We want to thank you again for being our guest on Chewing the Gristle. And this is Al Black with Tim Conroy. Have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me, man. This was an absolute blast. Chewing the Gristle.